All right, fantastic. All right, thank you all again for attending this workshop, which is obviously in the run-up to the GUDC 2023 tournament. It's an incredible honor to be able to be a part of the training portion of this tournament. Thank you so much to everyone who's invited me. I just want to start off this session by acknowledging the contributions that are reflected in this workshop, those being from Josh Freeman of LSC, UCL, Jacqueline Kwan, and Lucy Slimova of the Manchester Debating Union. I've tried to make sure that they're credited. And obviously, this workshop will be facilitated by me, but obviously, a lot of work done by them. So let's move forward straight into the training and we'll go to the first slide. So, what I want to start us off here with, do you want to go to page 2 for me? I'm not sure if it's just me, but I still am on the first page on the slide. There we go. So I want to talk about the key idea in judging. Just like speaking, judging is very much a comparative endeavor. So of course you can have saying sort of, I like this argument, I think they use this impact and their analysis is persuasive, but these are ultimately not useful in forming up a justifiable call. Instead, you need to decide whether or not arguments are more persuasive than other teams. For example, is their analysis more detailed or believable? And does one team's impacts outweigh others? Do teams fully respond to each other? By asking yourself those questions, you'll find yourself in a very strong position to come to a decent call. Let's move to the next slide. Again, also just any questions, drop them in chat, and then we'll address them as they come up. So the question that I think I often get, especially from people who are starting out judging, is what is the perspective that I adjudicate from? And in essence, it's a neutral one. In debating, we call it the perspective of the average intelligent voter, or sometimes the globally informed voter. This is someone who is from no particular country with no specific specialist knowledge. They read newspapers and have a general understanding of world affairs. Think of them as someone who reads like the front page of a newspaper every day. For example, they would know a little about global warming, but they might struggle to explain the consequences of a specific people or climate change policy on a specific country. The important thing to note here is that they're intelligent and capable of following arguments, but they need to be persuaded. They need to be persuaded if something is good enough. They have no preference towards one particular style or structure, or any or certain kinds of arguments. They do not insert themselves into the debate, and they do not discredit arguments based on their headlines. For instance, backlash, Marxism, free speech, etc. You must very much allow for teams to develop them. So you don't necessarily punish teams for missing the obvious argument you would have run, and you do not rebut their cases. Again, I'd also like to say that you obviously shouldn't insert your own biases or inherent preferences for or against certain things, for example, utilitarianism, but very much judge from a place of neutrality. And I think this is relatively intuitive, and I think, again, a lot of the judges of this tournament should be relatively experienced, but for those of you who aren't, this is generally something that is very important as you start off in developing your judging framework, is to make sure that you're actually introspecting and making sure that your decisions very much come from a place where you're not liable to insert your own biases, because we all have them, due to our personal positionality or personal political preferences, all of that. So just do your best to make sure you maintain a neutral perspective. Cool. Uh, I will. I am speaking a bit fast. I will definitely slow down. Um, okay, I'll try to be a bit louder as well. So, can you go to the next slide, please?
Yes, please, I can hear you.
Say that again.
Yeah, we can hear you better.
All right, fantastic. I'll try to be a bit clearer. Yeah, next slide, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so the headline is debating in terms of finding where you need to actually start your process is essentially comparing contributions. So you adjudicate the debate on what is left standing after all the teams in this debate have spoken. So for instance, team A give a good case, then team B give excellent rebuttal to that case, almost entirely defeating, then give a new case of their own, which is also good. After both teams have spoken, what is left standing is just a small part of case A, team A's case and B's whole case. So B outweighs A. The idea here is that you need to note that engagement, and again, evaluating engagement as a comparative between two teams is incredibly important. The next thing I want you to know, and this is really important, is that all comparisons are pairwise. So you only adjudicate based on what two teams say against each other, setting aside the contributions of other teams. So imagine then team C stand up and totally take out team B. This cannot affect the call between team A and B. This is really important because I think sometimes, especially newer judges, tend to evaluate things, across the entirety of the debate, applying mitigation delivered by a CG to, the responsiveness or the credit of an opening government. So I want you to be really, really clear and concise in noting that you have to be always operating from a sense of understanding pairwise comparisons and using those as the metric for adjudication. So to sort of summarize here, the mitigation of another team's case cannot directly contribute to their ability to win over a third team. I hope that's clear. I think this is actually relatively intuitive, and I think that's what makes the most sense. Because counter to like any world school style where there are simply two teams, we now actually have a greater metric to evaluate again the sort of dynamic along the diagonals and benches when necessary. All right, we'll move to the next slide. So this is sort of a continuation here. I want you to note that especially British parliamentary debating at university level is something that doesn't really consist of a evaluation of style. Of course, style can be a mechanism in terms of increasing persuasion, but primarily we adjudicate on the basis of the substance of the speech. The style and the structure are largely irrelevant and shouldn't inherently affect the call. You should do your best to follow even an unstructured speech. Failing to do so is unfair for the speakers involved. And I want to stress this, especially in engaging what most, like, especially as we debate in English, there are not, like, for instance, English second language speakers who shouldn't be penalized because they are, for instance, less, less, like their flow is somewhat worse than an English first language speaker. And I think there just needs to be a credit here in that you have an obligation as a judge to engage the true content, regardless of whether or not there is a massive amount of structure. Of course, structure can better a speech in terms of its ability to be understood from a like clarity point of view, but it cannot solely be credited. This is especially important when determining speaker scores. All right, fantastic. We'll move on to the next slide. And here's where we'll sort of get into the meat of the session. So the thing that I think even high-level adjudicators really struggle with is the ability to evaluate or create a metric for assessing arguments. And the next few slides are about how to do that in a reasonable way, but more specifically to create a situation where you can always be able to justify your call. Because I want to note this is the ultimate burden of an adjudicator. It's not to arrive at a call, but to be able to provide the that call and also provide an oral adjudication, which they have the ability to justify. If you're someone, and a judge who is a chair, and you come to a debate and you're unable to justify it, ultimately you failed in your burden and your role and obligation as a chair. So I want to note that at the top of this. So let's get straight into it here. Some mistakes that are done in terms of argument crediting. So like I said earlier, it shouldn't be crediting things like style or structure or time allocation. These are useful mechanisms for persuasion, and they can strengthen arguments, but they cannot be double credited. So you don't extra credit someone for being able to, have massively good structure. Like obviously their ability to incorporate structure would make their arguments more persuasive, and those are credited initially. You also shouldn't credit things like the number of arguments. The originality and the time spent. These are not themselves in and of themselves relevant. Again, so you cannot, for instance, say a team has 3 arguments versus another team's 1 and credit that as the reason as to why they do it. But also you should try to stay away from things like they only said it at 6:30. An argument can be well proven even in a limited amount of time. What I'd like you to note here is that when you deliver feedback like that, you need to make sure that it's clear that even though it was delivered late and thus it was underanalyzed, therefore it was not the highest in terms of the debate. Also, I want you to not overcredit teams for trying harder. So you felt as if the motions operated and the arguments were low hanging fruit. So the OG should be credited because they had to do more. These are generally things that you should try and leave at the door. Most motions, especially at ones like the major you're about to attend, have been stress tested by chief adjudicators, and there should be a significant amount of depth. And each team should have an equal chance of winning, given the motions have been tested quite well by strong chief adjudicators. But also, the last thing that I really want to stress here is that you should never assert your own metrics. Metrics do change depending on the debate and depending on what teams justify their metrics to be. But do not engage via your own spec knowledge of the topic or your own personal feelings. A metric that you think are most important, you need to engage the metrics that are provided within the scope of the debate that you're watching. All right, we'll go to the next slide. All right. When assessing arguments, you should not be asserting your own rebuttal, but you should be critically evaluate to what extent teams are in fact proving their arguments. And this goes back to our previous chat on the average intelligent voter. So again, you shouldn't be able to just overtly accept argumentation if it's not proven. You instead, and this is where I think of flag tracking is an important skill, you need to be able to flag the mechanisms or the mechanization that is done to actually provide or reach the conclusion of an argument. If you provide reasons and mechanisms in your argument, you should not be thinking of independent reasons as why you do not believe these to be true. And I want to also say that there is no binary between proven and not proven. Instead, it is a spectrum. So, for instance, there is likely some degree of proof that is done, or there is a lot of proof done, but it's somewhere between these two ideas. So, you need to actually conceptualize how strong is the matter that they provided in proving that they claim to be true. Again, I think there is some level of reading between the lines. When sometimes teams fail to prove what they said set out to prove, could achieve instead a smaller but arguably still important burden. So this is important to note here because obviously, especially when teams take on large burdens, maybe they prove it to like I don't want to say like 60% of proof, but something like that, right? Maybe they've not established it on like the scale that they'd like to set, but they've established for maybe a smaller actor or on a smaller scale. Then equally, we should be able to credit this argumentation. And I think especially here, when we're talking about um, argument argumentation on the diagonal and backlearning. Teams cannot directly engage in BP, right? So obviously the opening government team always had a somewhat negative ability to engage the closing opposition. And I think BP has tried to correct by this by forcing the engagement of one POI in every speech, but it's not guaranteed that this happens on the diagonal. So obviously in an ideal world you'd assess this engagement sort of through POIs, but oftentimes the POIs given don't really give you an opportunity for assessment. And what do you do if this doesn't happen? Honestly, you do have to lean on again that sort of reading between the lines of assessing whether or not the opening government's case actually engages the ideas and also the direct responsiveness of the closing opposition teams or the closing teams in general. Maybe to the next slide. Cool. So I want to talk about what not to credit because I think this is also an incredibly important thing we've been debating. There are a number of misconstrued, what can be credited. So let's go straight into it here. Um, I think I'm going to talk features first because whips are obviously not allowed to run completely new argumentation. The main reason here is that no one can really respond. But to what extent can you actually? The question you need to ask in terms of crediting whether or not something is new is to what extent could you expect this development after the extension speech? So, for instance, whips are allowed to bring new, for instance, slightly new framings, new impacts, and that sort of thing, if it can be considered a reasonable development after the delivery of an extension. This is, I think, the most intuitive way to weigh up whether or not a contribution in a whip speech is completely new and whether or not it can be considered holistically by judges. So again, yes, what can they add? New example, new characterization, new impact in your rebuttal. These are all permitted, but watch out for a rebuttal that is actually sneaky and substantive. And it is a very thin line here, but I do think that there is, again, obviously judges are trusted to sort of find that line and make sure that there is some level of clarity. The last thing I want to note is contradictions. Especially in majors where there are some novice speakers, there tend to be like a potential for contradiction. And in all honesty, it's just something you should be aware of here. If two arguments are in tension, but they do not fully contradict each other, they only weak each other, generally you can consider both to a reasonable degree. If two arguments are fully contradictory, i.e. one is true, one cannot be true if the other is true, the rule of thumb is to credit the one that came earlier. So if argument A comes first and argument B arrives and fully contradicts argument A, as long as argument A came first, then you should be able to credit argument A. The exception here is that generally sometimes people just sneak, and this is just like a relative rule of good faith, is that if you could clearly tell someone misspoke, don't penalize them on it. It's honestly just not a nice thing to do. But generally it could be clarified in the second speech and that should be allowed. So I want to talk about contradictions on the bench because I think there is a relative trend of closing teams to somewhat just respond to their closing straight up. And I want to dissuade you from this for two reasons. The first one is it just isn't fair to your opening, but also it puts you in a strategically weaker space, right? So you can marginalize the impact of the scale of your opening, but you should never be able to, obviously directly refute them. And judges, be aware of this. If you feel as if a team is directly responding to them, then I think you obviously have it's within your prerogative to say, this constitutes a knife, this constitutes a knife, and we're going to adjudicate it as directly contradicting the opening. All right, we'll move to the next slide. So this is the reason I added this to the slideshow was I think it's actually an incredibly valuable point of reference, especially for people as they start out in debating. And to be honest, even some really good judges have terrible note-taking techniques. But also, it goes back to the earlier thing that I had spoken about, which is around being able to justify a poll, especially in high quality rooms. If you do not take adequate notes, you will find yourself in a position where it is incredibly difficult to justify or find the difference between close polls because generally there is not a massive margin between teams in top rooms. And so it becomes your ability to actually track down argumentation to a high degree. So write notes that are clear, that you're able to navigate. I think I've actually removed the examples. But I think it's the main thing here is like just use lots of paper. Find a note-taking structure that allows you to go back. Use colors, use highlighters, use all of these things. And you know, you need to find a balance between writing too much and too little. You shouldn't be transcribing an entire speech, but you should not miss out on nuances and mechanisms. So, for instance, you know, within reason, right? You have obviously a reasonable expectation. Like if someone is speaking 1,000 words a minute, then you don't need to track 1,000 words a minute. There is a middle ground here. But if someone is speaking at a reasonable pace, they should be expected, or you should be expected to note down everything that they take. I would always say that having a master sheet really works out, where you have the bottom line of team arguments. These don't necessarily correspond to what teams flag because sometimes they lie, but it is specifically important points. But also the conclusion, or to what extent this conclusion was proved. The most crucial responses. You can also include notes on weighing that you intend to present during the deliberation in a way. To avoid factoring third teams into bilateral comparisons, judges point the debate. You should have a decision on the top half once the top half finishes. So, and this is just a note on how I do it, is that like if I'm adjudicating a debate, after each speech, I will go with a highlighter and highlight what I think are the most important comparisons or contributions from that speech. And then after each half, I will do an evaluation. Okay, cool. It's the end of the opening half. Who do I think is winning at this point? This is incredibly important because also in terms of deliberation, we generally have 15 minutes. And that 15 minutes is so limited in terms of time that we generally actually need to focus on getting a call done as soon as possible. So if you can do any work as a judge to make sure that there is an edge you can gain by having already thought about those conclusions as people are sitting up, standing down. You can really find yourself in a really good position. This is especially valuable to wing judges who are starting out and trying to break into that sharing place. We'll go to the next slide. So I want to talk about the process of judging because I think this is also underrated and also especially is the hallmark that separates a good judge from a great one. And I think obviously I've split into two sections because I think also a number of people like the chairs are actually the numerical minority at tournaments generally. So most people are winning. So how do you actually become a good winner? The first thing is that you need to focus on being concise and concrete in your justification. So the common mistake here is that you are too narrative or you repeat the term speeches. I want to note that like of course it is valuable to repeat some contributions at some points, but generally you don't want to sort of give the entirety of a speech if asked to substantiate a certain viewpoint. Instead, what you want to do is flag the most important things. And again, you do need to do some internal weighing here. What do I think is the most persuasive point? What is the key thrust of their case? By answering these questions, you'll find yourself being able to come up with those things. Focus on the contentions that made you give it to one team over the other. So again, if you think that there are four arguments in the opening government, but only argument 2 and 3 sort of dealt with the clash presented in the opening half are the ones that you credit highly. Clearly focus on the latter two arguments and obviously mention the first two, but only to a brief extent. So I also want you to try and stay away from the idea of saying things like they're more convincing or more persuasive. I think you need to flag the explicit analysis that makes you credit the team's contribution over the other. By doing this, you will note firstly whether or not it is proved, and you can double check. You note the strength of VP judging is that we get to use consensus. So we get to double check. We get to check if our perception of the debate is correct. So never feel as if you can't do that. And it's important to actually, note what you think is actually impactful for us to be able to move forward. The second thing I'd advise wings to do here is to focus on the comparative given to you by the chair. So oftentimes a chair will ask you to evaluate a specific clash, opening half, the long diagonal, the short diagonal, the back half, or specific ideas, or what do you in this clash between the opening half? What do you think about this specific argument? Who do you think it played out on? I want you to really try and dig down into your notes, take a second, and actually focus on contributing to that thing. Oftentimes, if you feel the need to rush, you might come up with, you just start talking nonsense. So you just take a second, look at your notes, and try to focus on the exact comparative. But also just don't be afraid to change your mind, right? Initial points are not binding, and the strength of VP deliberation is that you get to do it by consensus. So I think even like it's quite common. I think the best judges are people who are flexible on their call, but also I think justify why you're swapping. So don't just split because a CA is your chair and you have a different call to them. Just try to nail down it. But also I'd advise you that if you really don't think a team is persuasive, or if you don't think that the call is fair, then also maintain that split. It's definitely fine. In terms of being a good chair, and here I'll be a bit briefer. So it's pretty simple, right? I think the first thing to note is that you allow your panelists to give the calls first. And then how you should structure the discussion is based on the calls right? So if everyone agrees, you still confirm and you sort of act as the devil's advocate, oh, okay, how do we actually evaluate this? Even if we're in agreement, can you evaluate how this played out? What is the specific reason why this team lost against the other? If there's one disagreement, you start with that comparative first, because generally it's the place in which you need to get the most clarity in most things. If there is no, consensus, it's a massive amount of mess between all teams, then I think what you focus on is going chronologically. So you allow the minority judge or the judge who is the numerical minority for that call to justify theirs and note the specific contributions, and then you would alternate other panelists who are in the majority, ultimately calling it to a vote and then moving on that. It's a relatively simple process, but if there are any questions in deliberation, because this is a somewhat brief info slide on how to do it, definitely just drop a question in the chat and I'll do my best to respond to that. We can move to the next slide. All right. So on the process of judging an oral adjudication, this is, if I'm honest, the thing that really like puts judges up or puts them down in terms of feedback. And it's just because it goes back to the thing I said about like, I think you don't understand how much power you have as a judge and what the general level of power that you have means in terms of responsibility. So note that the debating is a very intense sport, and especially as speakers, or really as debaters, you should know, you put a lot of yourself into your speeches. And so even if a speech is terrible, and even if a speech comes forth in a debate, I think that we have the obligation at all times to reflect people's contributions adequately and make sure they feel seen in debates. This is not just my personal philosophy, but I think it's something that we should echo as a debating community, because I think oftentimes we only focus on individuals who we perceive to be the most successful, and we don't actually give enough justification for the teams who we think lose rooms, for the speakers who we don't perceive as valuable. And I think this means that oftentimes we don't give people the resources and the time that they need to improve, and it's something in general we need to focus on. That's just my personal viewpoint on it. But I do really think that, again, as judges, of course, you have a lot of power, but that also comes with a significant amount of responsibility to deliver a reasonable call that you are 100% comfortable in justifying. So how do we ultimately structure oral adjudications and personal feedbacks? So the first thing is, as a chair judge, when you stand up to do that personal feedback, focus on your master sheet and focus on the specific comparatives and case constructive content that you actually focused and that you credited within the deliberation. There aren't like multiple structures that people prefer. I will personally say that I do think the chronological structure tends to be the most useful and clearest, just because oftentimes the necessity to actually set out the structure of the debate supersedes the ability to supersedes the like any benefit you get from starting with the team that wins, even if it's a closing team, because you need to oftentimes understand where the arguments were created and how the evaluation of those things changed throughout the scope of the debate. I want to make sure that you walk through teams, because there are 6 comparatives, right? There is the OGOO, CGO, you can read them there. But it's essentially that you do the opening half comparisons, the closing, and then you make sure you do the diagonals as well as the benches. The example of the bilateral comparison structure is that like OG's structure would be engaged against OO's responsive, OO's substantive, OG's responsives, and then we do a final where. So that's if we were doing a opening half summary. You move through each you move through the opening substantive, you look at the responses to that, then you bring in the positive case, you look at the OG's responses, and then you do a final way up. And you do this for all teams. Your OA should be clear and concise, but it should also be comprehensive. I will say that I personally believe that any OA that's longer than 10, 12 minutes is probably a failure in terms of, you're just retelling the debate. I think it's important to note that, you address the major issues that are flagged. Um, and just say, like, for instance, if a major point ends up being irrelevant, explain why it fell out of the scope of the debate, or like do not just ignore it, do not just like not bring it up, because I think what this if you lead it leads you to a place where firstly teams do not perceive that their contributions was noted, and I'll flag this in relation to what I said about earlier. It's like, imagine like a team that came third delivered the entirety of the case on a certain idea, but that idea became non-contentious within the scope of the debate. You still need to flag how that played out, and you need to flag what the specific reasoning was there. Otherwise, you're obviously not giving that team a fair shake. This is obviously something you need to try and avoid to the highest degree. Moving then to the last element here, which is personal feedback. And I want to flag here that like personal feedback is again something that we give the right to adjudicators to give this to speakers, but also there exists an obligation to just not be an asshole. Like you do need to be someone who is genuine in terms of delivering criticism in a way that doesn't destroy someone's confidence, and also to be honest, gives them a constructive way to move forward. If you just don't believe in being a nice person, I would flag that speakers who come to you for personal feedback submit feedback on you. So even if you're not a nice person, and if you're self-interested, note that these people determine to an extent you're great. So giving them good feedback just gives you a better position later on in the thing. So again, I think in the first instance, you should give good personal feedback because it's a good thing to do to people. But if you don't believe in that, at least give it to them because you might benefit yourself. Let's move to the next slide. Yeah. Also, I'm so sorry if I'm speaking a bit quickly. At the end of the day, I'm a debater, and um, I tend to go a bit fast. So let's talk about some examples. And these I specifically included because I think sometimes we get bogged down in the technical, and we actually don't like talk about how this actually plays out in the scope of realistic debates. So there are four examples here. So, well, I think this is actually just one thing. So OG makes a good case with clear impacts. The OO gives then give rebuttal to the opening government, which mitigates a lot of the case, but doesn't take it out fully. However, OO does don't make any arguments of their own. Um, then we have, so I think later in, like, I think the following slides, the answers to these are on them. So we'll just run through all of the situations here. The second situation is where OG is winning after both teams have spoken. OG has little positive math material left, whereas OO have none. It doesn't matter that OG has less than what it's has less than what it says. It just stated. It just needs to be more than the opening opposition. OG just give a persuasive. Wait, actually, Desmond, if you go to the next slide, I forget how I structured these notes. Because I think the example section ends, so we can just skip the slide and go to the next one. Okay, yeah. I think the examples are at the end, so don't worry about that. We'll get back to the examples as we conclude the session. So I want to talk about just some important things that didn't really fit into any of the other categories so far. The first one is on tracking a debate. So I would generally advise at least a minimum of half a page for each team, split into two, and using that for each, like again, so basically a quarter of each page um, for people in terms of note taking. But generally, if I'm honest, doing high quality debates, we'll probably run at this page. So I would actually do a minimum of half a page per team for a speaker. Keep your head keep in your head who you think is winning so that you can come up with a call by the end of the debate. But also, I think it's useful to write a short summary after each speaker of their arguments. This can just help you, again, on that master sheet to keep a little bit of control. All right, we'll go to the examples, which I think on the next slide. All right, so these are meant to be like in a PDF so that we can example show up. But let's just run through each situation. So the question is who wins here? The opening government. And this is under the debate, this has to ban zoos, which is a relative classic and something that we can always just rely on. So there are some problems with zoos. For example, some animals don't have enough space. The opening opposition say zoos are the best way to protect endangered species. They make money for businesses and they put back into conservation. I think you need to flag here that the opening opposition wins, right? Because OG have made some general points about zoos, but they never explain why they should be banned, only why they can be improved. Opening opposition explain why banning them will have a real harm. Again, a loss of funding and endangered solutions. We can go to the next example. These are just, again, pretty classic ways to evaluate how contributions are in terms of, does someone meet their burden? What is the way they actually engage with the motion? So I think is it the same one or is it the next one? No, next one, I think. Yeah. All right. So opening government. Give me 1 second. Okay. Sorry. I just have to get off the bus. So opening government say all zoos have a profit motive, so they have an incentive to cram as many animals into tiny spaces as possible. This means they will always treat animals badly. The opening opposition then say some zoos have been good. For example, the London Zoo is involved in multiple conservation projects. I think opening government wins here because opening government gives reasons why zoos will always be bad and cannot be improved. Whereas OO just purely provide examples without giving reasons to explain why their arguments are typical or the standard. Does that make sense? Cool. We'll move to the next example. All right. So, opening governments say zoos have a profit motive, so they cram zoos into tiny spaces. Same argument as previously. The opening opposition then say zoos are well positioned to help with conservation, same as the previous. Now we have some rebuttal. even if they're able to do conservation, they most choose not to because it doesn't benefit their finances. Again, opening government win us because both make good arguments, but OO responds to opening opposition's case. Again, OO has pointed why even in the case that they can do it, they will mostly choose not to. Again, here, and this is just a good way to show at least how to track or facilitate or how to give some level of feedback if you're in a deliberation. How do you actually give that evaluation of arguments? This is a really good example of how to do that. We'll go to the next slide, which I think is another example. So OG says zoos are awful. Most of them trap whales in tiny pools for their whole lives while charging visitors extortionate amounts. They cannot be reformed because the government is captured by corporate interests, so they must be abolished. The cleansing government says zoos will treat animals badly because of their profit motive. This is the same as the earlier argument. I want to flag here, and this is somewhat counterintuitive. CG probably wins here because OG outline the example and argument and give examples. But the key here is why zoos will always treat animals badly, which is filled in by the closing government. The analytical extension is one kind of winning extension that the closing government can make. And I know this sounds like super counterintuitive, but you do need to try and break in and really note whether or not the argument is speaking to a core truth of the debate. And here, the closing government's ability to fill in that analytical gap gives them the extension or the ability to win out. We'll move to the next slide. All right. Damn, this would have been so much better. I had sent the PowerPoint because it sort of gives you the answer immediately, but that's okay. So opening opposition say they're good because they give visitors meaningful experiences. They help them connect to nature. After this experience, many of them go and donate to conservation. The CEO then say, by inspiring a generation of disassociated urban dwellers, zoos transform a relationship between intrepid visitors and invigorating the natural world around them, provoking them to offer real donations and organizing, donations to organizations championing real change and energizing them to live within a glorious mind. I want to flag here, and I think this is, I mean, I don't think this is as much of an issue in the Ghanaian circuit as in the international circuit, but obviously the opening opposition wins here. Like the closing opposition is very clearly derivative, and they have just used like again flowery language to sort of create the same idea. So again, it's your job to sort of delve down and actually find out whether it is a contribution. Is there another slide? Can we go to the next one? I think that might be it. Is that it? Yeah, I think that's it. All right, cool. So I think that brings me to the end of the sort of structured section of this session. I want to flag that I did when I was constructing these slides and trying to find resources to engage. I primarily focused on ideas and resources that I think would add or evaluate or benefit judges who are somewhat in the middle of their journey, not necessarily like specifically like judges who are just starting out. But I also just want to reiterate one thing before I move to any questions. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat space right now. I do believe that adjudication is probably probably significantly more difficult than debating in a number of ways, right? I think it firstly puts you in a position where you don't necessarily have to focus on one debate or one speech. Instead, you have to be able to focus on giving 8 debaters a justifiable call, and especially the better you get, the more you will find yourself judging in amazing debating rooms with amazing debaters. And so there is this obligation to be incredibly good. But I think that also comes with an obligation to just be focused. Like, I don't think you always need to be right. I do like I think you will always be in a situation where you have a panel to support you. And so if you're unsure, just be honest and open to the fact that you might not have the idea. If you think a comparison is close or you really can't find a way to split it up, focus and lean on the judges around you to actually give you that ability to get the right call. Because in all honesty, it's so much more important to come to the right call than it is to maybe just feel a bit embarrassed or maybe someone thinks that you're not 100% great. You really do need to try to be honest and recognize that even as we're competing as judges, we have to reflect and we have an obligation to all the speakers who just put their heart and their soul into their speeches. So yeah, I'll leave it there in terms of the explicit session. Any questions? Anything anyone wants to talk about in terms of the slideshow that they've had? I think Desmond sent me a few messages that I was speaking too quickly. So if there's something that like you are unclear on, if there's something that you want a bit of clarity on, or just like generally, it doesn't even have to be about adjudication. Like Desmond said, I've been debating for quite a while, and so I have a relative experience in a lot of what you're going through now. So please, any questions that you have, just let me know. I'll just give it a second, and then we'll see what I go after that. I'm not seeing any questions, which is fine. Uh, Obviously, it's okay if there are no questions. Um, so I think we'll just wait like 1 or 2 minutes, and then Desmond, just let me know. Is there anything you want me to focus on in order to this comp, or if there are no questions, you can maybe just end it there then. Okay. I assume that that's probably the case. So, in the absence of any questions, I would just want to thank you so much for the time. I'm incredibly sorry again about not having my camera on and the little bit of background noise that's been happening. I want to just flag one last thing, which is just my well wishes for the tournament. I think majors are incredibly trying times for most of us as debaters. We put a lot of ourselves into them. So just a little bit of advice from my side. Just do your best. Make sure that, even if you lose, you take stock in, the growth that you have during the tournament. I feel as my personal outlook on debating is that like if your last speech was your best one, regardless of whether or not you win or you lose, you're probably in a good position for growth. So yeah, that's my sort of concluding remark in the absence of any questions. Thank you so much for listening to me. And thanks again to the Ghanaian Circuit for the opportunity.